I woke up because my apartment was glowing blue, like someone had turned a spotlight right into my window, only this light wasn't normal. It vibrated, felt alive, made my teeth ache and my ears ring. I thought it was the police, or worse, a fire. I ran out onto the balcony in just my underwear, and there it was, hanging over the entire city, a thing the size of a football stadium. It wasn't flying or floating, it just was, like it had always been there, and we'd only now noticed. And then it hit me. This wasn't Earth tech. This wasn't anything from Earth. The whole city froze. Cars stopped in the middle of the road. People stood with their heads tilted back, some crying, some filming. And I just stood there thinking this was the end, that any second it would be like in the movies, beams, explosions, invasion. But nothing happened. A minute, 2, 5. That thing just hung there silently, and then a voice spoke, not in my ears but straight into my head, in all languages at once. It said, humanity was invited to some kind of arena, that it was an honor, that we had to send representatives or remain isolated forever. And right then, I realized my life had just split into before and after. A week later, the whole world had gone insane. Scientists, politicians, the military, everyone arguing about what to do, who to send, whether it was a trap or real. I sat at home watching the news, showing the UN calling an emergency meeting, people flooding the streets with signs, some demanding volunteers be sent, others shouting it was all a lie. A friend from Moscow called, said his acquaintance, a physicist, got a personal invitation, that the selection didn't make sense. Not the smartest, not the strongest, just random people. I joked that it was good they didn't pick me, because I was just an engineer working at a factory, no special skills, unless you count the card tricks I do at office parties. And then, the letter came. Not by mail, not by email. It literally materialized on my desk, a blue envelope made of a material that was warm and cold at the same time, with my name on it and coordinates for the gathering point in Geneva. I read it 10 times, thinking I was losing my mind, but it was real. I touched it, smelled it, even tried to tear it. It wouldn't tear. When I arrived in Geneva, our team was already there, 5 of us from different countries. A woman around 40, a military strategist from Israel, with a look that said she'd seen things scarier than aliens. A skinny guy in glasses, a quantum physicist from Japan, constantly mumbling to himself and scribbling formulas in a notebook. A 25-year-old psychologist from Brazil, kind eyes, but I could tell she was analyzing every one of us like she was scanning us. And another guy, a hacker from Germany, looked like a stereotypical geek, but rumor had it he'd hacked NATO systems just for fun. And I sat there wondering, why me? What could I possibly contribute? They told me I was chosen because I could perform tricks, because I was unpredictable, but it sounded like a joke. They took us to an underground complex where a capsule stood, shaped like an egg made of black glass, and told us that in 1 hour we'd be sent to the place where humanity's fate would be decided. 1 hour. An hour before your life flips inside out, and you sit there drinking vending machine coffee trying not to puke from fear. When we materialized on the arena, I realized everything I knew about reality was child's play. The planet was alive. I felt it instantly. It breathed. Energy pulsed beneath our feet. The sky changed color every few minutes from violet to gold, and the horizon bent as if you were looking through a lens. And then there were them, the other races. The Archons looked like moving crystal statues, 4 meters tall, glowing from within, silent, but their presence pressed on your mind like something ancient and all-knowing was standing next to you. The Luminars were clusters of light with no bodies in the usual sense, shifting from form to form, and when they looked at you, you felt your thoughts turn transparent. And the swarm, that was a nightmare. Millions of tiny creatures moving as a single organism, forming shapes, faces, humming so loudly it felt like they were everywhere at once. And all of them looked at us. 5 humans who yesterday were drinking coffee in Geneva. like something amusing, primitive, unworthy of this place. That's when I understood. We weren't guests here. We were the exotic creatures they were about to test for durability. When the holographic message appeared above every major city on Earth at the same time, I was just coming back from a night shift, thinking only about getting to my bed. But all transportation stopped. People poured into the streets, and above Moscow, New York, Tokyo, London, everywhere, those projections hung, massive and three-dimensional, showing beings that couldn't be described in human terms. They spoke in all languages at once, their voices sounding like a choir of 1,000 instruments, and the message was terrifyingly simple. Humanity had 30 Earth days to send its representatives to the arena, or we would be isolated forever, cut off from the rest of the galaxy by a technological barrier, left here on the edge of space like children locked in a room for bad behavior. No threats of destruction, no violence, just a cold, emotionless offer that couldn't be refused. I stood in the square among the crowd, and everyone was silent, because in that moment we all understood. The world had just changed, and there was no way back, and whatever we chose, the consequences would last for generations. The next 2 weeks were chaos. Governments from all countries met for an emergency summit. Scientists tried to understand how such technology was even possible. The military planned for a potential invasion, and regular people, some stocked up on food and built bunkers, others threw parties, deciding that if the world was ending, they wanted to go out in style. I kept going to work because I didn't know what else to do, but the factory barely operated. Half the people didn't show up, and those who did just sat around watching the news on their phones. The UN announced they were forming a delegation, and the selection process began. At first, they considered sending astronauts, generals, Nobel Prize winners. But then, something strange happened. The message updated, saying the candidates had to be chosen not by logic, but by some system of theirs, based on analyzing all of humanity. And a week later, a list of 5 names arrived. 5 people out of 7 billion. And one of those names was mine. I found out from the news when the anchor read the names, and mine was the 3rd. My phone blew up instantly. Parents, friends, journalists, all asking how it happened, and I had no answer because I didn't understand it myself. They called me to Geneva 2 days later, and that's where I met the others for the first time. Rachel Avital was the first, a woman around 40, short hair, a former Israeli intelligence officer, spoke little, but every word felt like a command. She had the aura of someone used to making life and death decisions. Kenji Tanaka looked like a typical professor, glasses, messy hair, always lost in thought. But when he spoke about quantum physics, it became clear his mind worked on frequencies normal people couldn't reach. Luisa Carvalho was the opposite, young, smiling, moving lightly, but I noticed how she observed each of us the way a psychologist studies patients, and I realized that behind that softness was a razor-sharp, analytical mind. Stefan Muller sat in the corner with a laptop, a skinny guy with a sarcastic smile. Rumor had it he hacked banking systems for fun and was never caught. Then they all looked at me, and Rachel asked who I was and why I'd been chosen. I said I worked as an engineer at a factory and sometimes performed card tricks at parties. Silence. Stefan laughed first, said it must have been someone's joke, but the UN representative stepped in and explained. The alien system chose me specifically for that, for improvisation and unconventional thinking, for creating illusions and manipulating perception. It sounded like a compliment, but to me, it felt like a sentence. The final week before departure was strange. They put us in a closed facility, ran tests, physical and psychological, tried to prepare us for something no one could prepare for. Scientists explained that the arena wasn't just a planet, but an artificial world created by ancient civilizations to resolve conflicts, that it didn't test strength but intellect, not technology, but the ability to think. But no one knew the details because no human had ever been there. I called my parents every day. My mother cried and begged me to refuse, but I couldn't. One refusal meant the mission failed, and a failed mission meant Earth's isolation. My father said just one thing: do what you think is right. And I heard the pride in his voice, the kind he never expressed openly. On the last night we all sat together, and Louisa asked if we were afraid. No one answered at first. Then Kenji said, fear was a natural reaction to the unknown. But the unknown is what drives evolution. Rachel added that people fear because they want to live, and that this was a good sign. Stefan joked that if there was Wi-Fi there, everything would be fine. And I sat there thinking that tomorrow my life would either end or become something I couldn't even imagine, and both possibilities terrified me equally. Teleportation isn't like in the movies where you disappear in one place and appear in another with a bit of dizziness. It felt like every atom of my body was taken apart, pushed through a grinder made of light and pain, and then put back together again, but not with full confidence that everything was placed correctly. I was screaming, though I couldn't hear my own voice. I felt my consciousness stretch across millions of miles, like I was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and then impact. I hit my knees, gasping for air with a metallic taste in my mouth. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't control them, and my vision was blurry. Nearby, Kenji was vomiting, Louisa was clutching her head and quietly groaning. Stefan was lying on his side, laughing hoarsely and repeating that it was insane. And Rachel was already standing, even though her face was white as chalk, looking around like she was preparing for a fight. When my sight finally cleared, I lifted my head and realized we weren't on Earth anymore, and not even in the part of space we knew. We were in a place that shouldn't exist. The planet was the size of Jupiter, but its gravity was almost like Earth's, which already broke every physical law I knew. The sky was strange, not blue, not black, but shifting through every shade at once, like a stretched-out aurora covering the entire sky. Shapes moved inside it, huge shadows or maybe clouds, I couldn't tell. Under our feet was a surface like polished obsidian, black and smooth but warm, with cracks running through it that glowed blue from within, like veins of some living creature. In the distance, I saw structures, floating platforms the size of skyscrapers connected by bridges made of pure light, waterfalls flowing upward instead of down, forests of trees with crystal leaves, deserts where the sand was purple and moved in waves even though there was no wind. Kenji muttered something about artificial gravity and spatial distortion, but his voice was trembling, and I realized even his mind couldn't fully process what we were seeing. This wasn't just a planet. It was a world built by beings for whom the laws of nature were only suggestions. We were standing on some kind of platform, and that's when I noticed them, the other participants. The first ones I saw were the Archons, and my heart dropped with a fear that felt instinctive, ancient, the kind of fear you feel in front of something that is above you in every possible way. They were about 4 meters tall, but felt enormous because the space around them seemed to warp. They were made of crystals, both transparent and smoky, and their forms constantly shifted, their edges rearranging into geometric shapes I couldn't name. They had no faces, but I could feel them looking at us, and that look carried so much contempt, so much cold superiority, that I felt like an ant in front of a human. They didn't move, but their very presence made it seem like every moment of their existence weighed more than the entire history of humanity. Next to them were the Luminars, beings made of pure light. They had no fixed form, flowing from one shape to another, sometimes taking on humanoid outlines, sometimes becoming a formless mass of energy. When one of them looked in my direction, I felt something touch my mind, gently but insistently, like someone trying to open a door in my head. I quickly turned away, pain shot through my temples, and Louisa grabbed my hand and whispered, "Don't meet their eyes, they're telepaths." Then I heard a hum, low and vibrating, coming from inside the planet and from the air at the same time, and I saw the swarm. It was impossible to describe. Imagine a cloud of trillions of insects, each the size of a bee, moving with such perfect synchronicity that they formed shapes, faces, arms. They formed a humanoid figure about 5 meters tall, and this shape looked at us with thousands of eyes. The hum grew louder, and I understood that this was their voice. They communicated through vibrations, through a collective mind in which each creature was a neuron in a massive brain. Stefan swore. Kenji stepped back, and Rachel pulled a knife from her pocket, even though it was useless against creatures like this. The swarm shaped something like a mouth and produced a sound that resembled speech, distorted and multiplied, and I caught the meaning. You humans, you are new. You will not survive. It didn't sound like a threat, more like a statement of fact, as if they had already calculated every outcome and knew the result. I looked at my team, 5 people who a week ago didn't even know other races existed, and realized we weren't just outsiders here. We were the condemned ones, and everyone around us had already dug our graves. They gathered us in the central hall, a space the size of a football field, but its walls were transparent, and beyond them I saw infinity. Stars, galaxies, nebulae, all of it shifting and pulsing like something alive. In the center of the hall floated a sphere made of something resembling liquid metal, and from it came a voice that sounded both mechanical and organic at once. It explained the rules, and I tried to memorize every word, even though my mind refused to accept what I was hearing. The arena does not test physical strength, it does not test military power or technology. All of that is primitive for civilizations that have existed for millions of years, the voice said. The arena tests the ability to solve problems that have no solution, the ability to think beyond logic, the ability to find exits where none exist. Each race will face a series of trials, and those who fail will not be removed from the game. Their civilizations will be isolated forever, cut off from the galactic community, doomed to develop alone until the very end. A cold shiver ran down my back because the stakes weren't just high. They were absolute, and a mistake meant losing the future of all humanity. The first trial was called the Diplomat's Paradox, and the idea sounded absurdly simple. We had to negotiate with the chronophages, a race that perceives time not linearly, but as a single field where the past, present, and future exist simultaneously. They communicate through sense, but not normal sense. Sense of time itself, the smell of what was and what will be. And for them, communication is an exchange of probabilities and memories encoded in chemical compounds. The task was insane. We had to convince them to sign a cooperation agreement using only their method of communication, without words, without gestures, only through sense we couldn't even perceive without special equipment. The Archons approached the task first. I saw them create an algorithm, a mathematical model of all possible combinations of sense. They worked quickly, their crystalline bodies glowing from calculations, and within 10 minutes they produced a perfect sequence, precise down to the molecule. The chronophages, who looked like translucent jellyfish with thousands of tendrils, didn't react at all. They simply disappeared, leaving behind the smell of decay, which in their language meant a categorical refusal. The Luminars tried telepathy. They attempted to enter the chronophages' minds directly, bypassing the barrier of time and language, and I saw the air around them twist with energy, light becoming almost solid. But the chronophages vanished again, leaving behind the scent of cold and emptiness. The swarm created a simulation, trillions of their units producing pheromones in different combinations, trying through sheer brute force to find the correct sequence. The hall filled with thousands of scents at once, from sweet to harsh, and I thought I was going to suffocate. But the chronophages appeared only for a moment, left behind the scent of disappointment, and dissolved again. All 3 races failed, and silence fell over the hall, heavy and crushing. Then the metallic voice announced, it was humanity's turn. We exchanged looks. Kenji pulled out his notebook and started writing something about temporal paradoxes. Rachel suggested using military negotiation tactics. Stefan said we could try hacking the scent generator system, but I saw that they were all panicking because the task was impossible. And then Louisa looked at me and asked, What if we don't try to solve the problem but change its conditions? I don't know what came over me. Maybe fear, maybe desperation, or maybe just the realization that there was nothing left to lose. I walked up to the scent generator they had given us, a suitcase-sized device covered in indicators and buttons, and instead of creating a logical sequence of scents, I started pressing buttons at random, creating complete chaos. The smell of fried potatoes mixed with flowers, then gasoline, then fresh-cut grass, a wet dog, coffee, all of it layered together into absurd cacophony. Kenji grabbed my hand and hissed at me, asking what I was doing, but I didn't stop. I added the scent of baby powder, then old books, then hit the button that produced a non-existent smell, something like the scent of the color violet or the sound of silence. And then, something unbelievable happened. The chronophages appeared, all of them at once, at least 20, their tendrils trembling as they began emitting scents in response, a whole symphony of aromas. Stefan, who had plugged a translator into the generator, said in shock, "They're laughing, these things are laughing. They're saying this is the first time in 1,000 years they met someone who didn't try to understand them, but simply existed with them in the same chaos." The agreement was signed. The chronophages agreed to cooperate because we showed them something no other race had: unpredictability, absurdity, the ability to break the rules even when the rules seemed absolute. When we returned to the platform, the Archons stared at us with something like shock. The swarm hummed in confusion, and I stood there thinking, we had just won by doing everything wrong, and that was either our greatest advantage or we were just incredibly lucky idiots. After our victory in the first trial, we were taken to a separate rest area, a room with transparent walls where the landscapes kept changing. One moment an ocean, then mountains, then empty space. I never figured out if they were real or holograms. We sat on something like benches, though the material under us was warm and adjusted to our bodies, and tried to process what had happened. Stefan laughed, repeating that we pulled off the impossible. Louisa smiled, but I could see the tension in her eyes. Kenji shook his head and muttered that our success contradicted every known communication protocol. Rachel stayed silent, staring at the wall, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. This wasn't a victory, it was an accident, and if we had to repeat something like that again, we might not make it. But what worried me even more was this: I saw how the other races looked at us after the results were announced, and in their gazes, or whatever counted as gazes for them, there wasn't respect. There was something like concern mixed with confusion, as if we'd done something forbidden, violated some unspoken rule no one told us about. An hour later, we were summoned to the Council of the Ancients, and it felt like standing before a court of gods. The hall was enormous, the ceiling lost somewhere far above, and in the center floated 5 entities, the representatives of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, the ones who created the arena and had overseen it for millions of years. The Archon was there, looking even more massive and ancient, his crystalline body emitting waves of cold light. When he spoke, his voice resonated in my chest like a low-frequency hit. He said our method of solving the task was unacceptable, that we had used chaos instead of logic, randomness instead of calculation, and that this approach was dangerous because it couldn't be analyzed or predicted. The Luminar representative, a cluster of light constantly shifting from gold to silver, added that they had scanned our thoughts during the trial and found no clear strategy. Our decisions were taken impulsively, based on emotion and instinct rather than rational thinking. The swarm buzzed, its trillion organisms vibrating in unison, creating a sound that the translator interpreted as an accusation. Humans are unpredictable. They don't follow algorithms. They are a threat to system stability. I stood there, trying not to show fear, realizing we were being judged not for failure, but for success, because we won by breaking rules that had been set millions of years ago. The Archon demanded our disqualification. His voice was completely confident. He said humanity wasn't ready for the galactic community, that our chaotic thinking could disrupt a balance maintained for millennia, that it was better to isolate us now than risk unpredictable consequences later. The other members of the council stayed silent, and I saw some of them leaning toward agreement. The atmosphere in the hall was heavy, pressing, like the air before a storm. But then, another entity intervened, one I hadn't seen before. It looked like a cloud of particles constantly shifting shape, sometimes forming a vague face, sometimes dissolving into abstract patterns. Its voice was strange, like an echo of an echo. It introduced itself as the Observer, a species older than all the others, dedicated to studying the evolution of intelligence. It said the human case was unique, that in the entire history of the arena, no race had ever demonstrated such a level of unpredictability, and that this called for study, not immediate condemnation. It suggested analyzing human thinking, understanding the mechanism that allowed us to find solutions beyond logical systems, and only after that deciding our fate. The council agreed, although the Archon radiated displeasure. His crystals darkened, and I felt we'd been given a delay, not a pardon. The next days were a nightmare. They separated us, put each of us in a different chamber, though they called it a research lab, and began scanning. They connected devices to me that read brain activity, analyzed every thought and emotion. I saw holograms of my memories projected in front of me, me learning card tricks as a kid, improvising on stage, changing plans at the last moment when something went wrong. The Observer was always there, its particles forming a face near me, asking questions: why I chose those specific smells, why I ignored logic, where the ability to act without a plan came from. I tried to explain that it wasn't an ability, more like the absence of fear of being wrong, that humans were used to improvising, because our history is full of moments where survival depended not on strength or intelligence, but on how fast we could adapt. It listened, its particles vibrating, and I had no idea whether I was convincing it or digging my own grave. When the scan ended, they returned me to the team. Kenji said they asked him the same questions, trying to understand how the human mind could generate solutions without prior calculations. Louisa said they were especially interested in emotions, in our ability to feel and act at the same time. We sat together exhausted, realizing we had become a subject of study for beings who had long forgotten what it meant to not know an answer ahead of time. And our unpredictability to them was like a virus they were trying to break down into components to learn whether it was dangerous or useful. The second trial was announced 3 days after the research phase ended, and this time the task was more concrete. We were given access to a storage hall filled with artifacts of a dead civilization, a race called the Precursors, who vanished 500,000 years ago, leaving behind only fragments of technology even the Archons couldn't fully understand. The storage hall was the size of a hangar, packed with metal structures, crystals, and mechanisms, some parts glowing, spinning, or floating in the air, as if gravity didn't apply to them. Everything was covered in the dust of ages, but I could feel that every piece carried knowledge humanity wouldn't accumulate even in 1,000,000 years. The task sounded simple. Using only these fragments, we had to build a working device capable of solving the energy collapse simulated for the trial. In essence, we had to assemble a generator powerful enough to supply an entire planet. We had 12 hours, and each race received access to the same set of artifacts. I looked at the mountains of incomprehensible parts and realized we didn't even know where to start. Precursor technology wasn't just beyond us, it was on a level we couldn't even conceptualize. The Archons were the first to begin, and it was mesmerizing. They scanned every artifact, their crystalline bodies radiating waves of energy as they analyzed material structures on an atomic level. They created a three-dimensional model in the air, perfectly calculated, with each piece placed according to mathematical laws. I watched as they joined components using force fields, the mechanism assembling itself under their control, and after 6 hours, they had a generator. Elegant, symmetrical, flawless. They activated it, and the device worked, producing a stable energy output with perfect readings. The Council of the Ancients hummed in approval. The Luminars took a different path. Instead of building a physical structure, They formed an energy matrix, using the artifacts as nodes in a network that channeled light flows and converted them into energy. It looked like a dance. Their forms blended with the mechanisms, and the result was nearly as efficient as the Archons. The swarm created their device through collective labor. Millions of their small bodies carried parts and assembled them with microscopic precision, forming a generator that looked alive, pulsing and adapting, and it worked too, though with lower stability. All three races succeeded, and I saw the way they looked at us, expecting failure. We had none of their computational power, none of their energy manipulation, none of their collective intelligence. We stood before the pile of artifacts, and Kenji was trying to analyze something, writing down formulas. But after an hour, he admitted he didn't understand the principles behind most of the components. Precursor technology was too advanced. Rachel suggested copying the Archon's method, trying to recreate their design, but Stefan pointed out we lacked their tools and abilities. We couldn't even lift some of the parts without special equipment. Louisa sat aside, staring thoughtfully at the artifacts, then asked me, "What if we don't try to understand how it works at all, and just connect pieces to see what happens?" It sounded insane, but we had no other ideas, so I agreed. We started building the device randomly. I grabbed parts I liked visually. Stefan added the ones that seemed interesting to him. Kenji protested that this violated every engineering principle ever, but eventually gave up and began attaching pieces that simply fit well together in shape. After 4 hours, we had something that looked like an abstract sculpture. Crystals sticking out at odd angles, metal plates joined with no logical pattern, a sphere spinning in the center and emitting a soft, buzzing sound, all of it held together more by hope than physics. Rachel called it a useless machine, and she was right. When we tried activating it, nothing happened. It just stood there buzzing, producing no energy at all. We were about to admit defeat when something strange happened. Our machine began to vibrate, softly at first, then more intensely, and suddenly it released an energy pulse. But unlike the other races' directed output, ours was chaotic. Waves surged in all directions, and one of them struck an ancient artifact standing in the corner of the hall, a huge monolith 5 meters tall, covered in symbols. No one had touched it because it was assumed to be just decorative, a leftover piece of a precursor temple. And the monolith awakened. The symbols on its surface lit up with blinding light. A column of energy erupted from it, piercing the ceiling and shooting into the sky. And then the monolith began generating energy in such massive quantities that all instruments in the hall maxed out. This wasn't just a generator. It was a source powerful enough to fuel not a planet, but an entire star system. The Council of the Ancients froze. The Archons radiated shock. The Luminars scattered in panic. The swarm buzzed in confusion, and we stood there without understanding what had just happened. Then the observer explained. The monolith was protected by precursor security protocols, and it could be activated only by receiving a signal of a specific frequency and chaotic signature. A signal impossible to create intentionally because any logical system would filter out such chaos as an error. We triggered it by accident because our device was so nonsensical it bypassed all protections designed to prevent a logical hack. We won again and again by doing everything wrong, and I saw the Archon looking at us, and in its faceless crystalline form, I recognized something like fear. Because we had proven twice that chaos could overpower order, and that shook the foundations of their million-year-old civilization. After the second trial, they didn't send us back to the rest area. Instead, they kept us in the central hall, and I realized right away that something had changed. The atmosphere was heavy and tense, like before a storm. The other races stayed away from us, and the members of the Council of the Ancients gathered for a closed meeting. Their forms floated inside a separate section of the hall, surrounded by an energy barrier, and only fragments of their arguments leaked through it. I saw an Archon gesturing, its crystalline body flashing with red sparks that clearly meant anger or concern. The luminars darted between the forms, their light shifting from bright to dim. The swarm buzzed at frequencies that made the walls vibrate, while the observer remained motionless. Her cloud of particles pulled tightly together as if she were focused on something important. Stefan tried to tap into their communication network with his portable computer, but the device just shut down and burned out from overload. He swore and said the level of encryption was so high that breaking it wasn't possible even in theory. We waited, and I could feel fear slowly climbing up my spine because I knew our victories hadn't earned us allies. They'd earned us enemies. And now, our fate was being decided somewhere behind that barrier, without us. The barrier fell 2 hours later, and the council returned to the main hall, but I could tell instantly that they were no longer united. They stayed in separate groups, and when a Luminar began to speak, her voice sounded different. Not cold and emotionless like before, but with a hint of curiosity, almost admiration. She said that human unpredictability wasn't a flaw in our thinking, but a unique evolutionary strategy. That in millions of years of observing the galaxy, they had never encountered a race capable of generating true randomness in its decisions, because all advanced civilizations eventually moved toward optimization, logic, determinism, while we remained stuck at a stage where chaos still played a role, giving us access to solutions others simply couldn't find because they filtered them out as irrational. She proposed continuing to study humanity, giving us a place in the galactic community under supervision, using our ability to solve problems that defied logical analysis, turning us into a kind of tool for working with the unknown. When I heard that, I felt a chill. She wasn't talking about us as equals, but as a useful anomaly to be exploited. And even though that was better than destruction, her words were unsettling. Then the swarm spoke, and its voice sounded like the hum of 1,000 hives, layered and overwhelming. It said they had analyzed every possible scenario of humanity's future, calculating billions of outcomes using data collected during the trials, and the result was clear. Humans are dangerous precisely because we're unpredictable. It explained that any civilization whose behavior can't be modeled poses a threat to the stability of the galactic community, because it's impossible to predict what they'll do in a critical moment or build long-term relationships based on calculations and guarantees. The swarm projected holograms, hundreds of scenarios where humanity, after gaining access to advanced technology, acted unpredictably. Sometimes it led to breakthroughs, but more often to conflicts, disasters, violations of established protocols. It gave statistics. In 70% of simulations, humanity's presence in the galactic community led to destabilization within 1,000 years. And though 1,000 years was just a moment to them, the risk was too high. The swarm proposed isolation as a compromise, not destruction, but complete disconnection of Earth from the galaxy, creating a barrier we couldn't cross even in 1,000,000 years. Let us develop on our own, without outside influence and without posing a threat to others. And then the Archon rose, and its presence was overwhelming. It radiated cold fury that manifested as waves of pressure in the air, and when it spoke, its voice resonated in my bones. I felt every word like a physical blow. It said that both the Luminars and the Swarm's proposals were half measures, that humanity wasn't just a threat to stability, but a threat to the very concept of a rational civilization. Because we had proven that order, logic, and millions of years of development could be defeated by impulse, randomness, chaos. The Archon said that if younger races learned this, if they saw that it was possible to win by ignoring the rules established by the ancients, then the entire system of galactic governance would collapse. An era of unpredictability would begin, where no one could plan for the future, and civilizations would destroy each other in chaotic conflicts. It proposed the only solution that guaranteed safety: the preemptive destruction of Earth. Total, without warning. A sterilization of the planet so complete that life could never return. And it needed to be done now, while humanity was still confined to one world and hadn't spread into the galaxy. It said this calmly, as if proposing a technical solution to a technical problem. And I stood there listening to a being that had lived for 1,000,000 years discussing the genocide of my species with the same tone someone might use to discuss repairing a broken machine. In that moment, I realized, to them, we weren't people. We weren't even animals. We were just a variable in an equation that needed to be removed to achieve a stable result. And my fear turned into anger, because I understood that all their greatness, all their so-called wisdom of millions of years, was just fear of what they couldn't control. The council was paralyzed. The vote had reached a deadlock. The Luminars were for studying us, the Swarm for isolation, the Archons for destruction. And the observer remained silent, her cloud of particles slowly rotating as if she was contemplating something beyond our understanding. We stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by beings for whom the fate of an entire planet was just a topic of discussion, and I felt helplessness mixing with despair because nothing depended on us. We couldn't influence their decision, we couldn't run, we couldn't even properly defend ourselves. And then the observer spoke, her voice echoing like it came from infinity, and she said, there was one way to resolve the dispute. A final trial, the last and absolute one that would determine once and for all whether humans deserved a place in the galaxy or had to be eliminated. She called it the survival dilemma and explained the rules. Every race, including humans, would be given a choice in a simulated real crisis, and that choice would reveal the true nature of their civilization. The council agreed, even the Archon, though I could see he radiated displeasure, his crystals darkening almost to black. We were given an hour to prepare, and we gathered together, trying to guess what awaited us. But there was no information, only fear, and the understanding that this was humanity's last chance. We were placed in separate capsules, devices that looked like sarcophagi made of glowing metal. And when the lid closed over me, panic hit. Darkness, silence, only the sound of my heartbeat. Then the world flashed to life around me, and I found myself inside a simulation so realistic I couldn't tell it apart from reality. I was standing in the control center of some space station. People in uniform were running around, shouting commands, warning lights flashing on the screens, and a voice over the speakers announced, a critical anomaly had been detected, an energy rupture spreading at the speed of light, destroying everything in its path. And we had two options. The first, activate a protective barrier around Earth. It would save humanity, but the barrier would require so much energy that it would trigger a shockwave capable of wiping out all inhabited systems within 1,000 light years, killing billions instantly. The second option, redirect the energy backward, create a counter-impulse that would neutralize the anomaly and save all other civilizations, but Earth would be in the direct path of the rupture and would be completely destroyed. We'd have 10 minutes for evacuation, but only a small fraction of the population could be saved. Billions would die. The voice said, the choice was mine. Command had transferred full authority, and I had 60 seconds. I stood over the console, my hands shaking, my brain refusing to work because both options were nightmares, and I realized this wasn't just a trial. It was torture, because there was no right answer. Later, when it was over, I learned what the other races chose, and it was revealing. The Archons chose the second option in 4 seconds, their logic flawless. Sacrifice the smaller number to save the greater, preserve billions of alien lives at the cost of their own civilization. Mathematically optimal, cold, and rational. The Luminars chose the same, but slower. 20 seconds. They scanned every possibility and concluded that collective good outweighed individual survival, that the sacrifice of one race was justified if it saved many others. The Swarm ran billions of simulations in 30 seconds and also chose the second option, their collective mind calculating every probability and deciding that saving the majority was the only logical path. All three ancient races sacrificed themselves in the simulation, and it was meant to prove their moral superiority, their readiness to give their lives for the greater good, their maturity as civilizations. When they showed me the results, I felt sick, not because of their choice, but because of how easily they made it, how quickly they accepted the destruction of billions of their own, as if it were just a number in an equation. And I thought, maybe that's the problem. Maybe when you've lived 1,000,000 years, life becomes less valuable, an abstraction, a statistic, and you forget that behind every number is a being that wants to live, love, hope. And I didn't choose. 60 seconds passed, and the system started beeping, demanding an answer, the voice growing more urgent, people on the station looking at me with desperation and hope, and I stood there thinking, this is wrong. Both choices are wrong. It can't be that the only decision is choosing who dies. And then I did what I'd done all my life when faced with the impossible. I started searching for a third option, one that wasn't in the rules. I looked at the console, at the diagram of the energy rupture, and suddenly saw something everyone had missed. The anomaly moved in waves, not a solid front, and between the waves were gaps, microseconds where the energy dropped almost to zero. I grabbed an engineer and asked, can we sync the barrier to activate only in those gaps, in pulses, not continuously? It would cut energy usage by thousands of times. He looked at me like I was insane, said it was impossible to calculate. The synchronization would have to be perfect, a nanosecond off and everything collapses. But I didn't listen. I was already working the console, not using calculations but intuition, a sense of rhythm, like when you perform a trick and need to catch the exact moment the audience looks away. I tuned the barrier frequency by feel, relying on how the waves looked on the screen, their visual pattern, and hit activation. The barrier fired up, pulsing, flickering, and it worked. The energy was enough to protect Earth, but there was no backwave to destroy other systems. The anomaly passed through the gaps, dispersed beyond inhabited space, and everyone survived. The simulation ended, the capsule opened, and I rolled out, gasping, drenched in cold sweat, and the Council of Ancients stood around me. For the first time, I saw something like shock on their inhuman faces because I had done the impossible. I refused to choose between two bad answers and found a third one that didn't exist until I created it. After the simulation ended, the hall fell into absolute silence, so complete that I could hear my own breathing and the pounding of my heart, racing after everything I'd just been through. The Council of the Ancients stood frozen, their forms unmoving, and I couldn't tell what was happening, whether they were processing the information or simply didn't know what to do with a result that didn't fit any of their models. The Archon was the first to snap out of it. His crystal body flared with red light, and he began emitting waves that the translator interpreted as accusations. I had broken the rules of the simulation, used a solution that wasn't part of the provided options, acted outside the established parameters, which made the result invalid and required disqualification. The swarm hummed in agreement, their trillion minds vibrating in sync, creating a sound of protest. They repeated that the third option didn't exist in the original data, that I created it out of nothing, relying on chance instead of calculation, and that such an outcome couldn't be accepted as a victory. But the Luminars remained silent, their forms pulsing slowly with shifting colors, and I could see that they were thinking, analyzing, trying to understand the meaning of what had happened. And the observer stayed motionless, her particle cloud condensed into a dense sphere, and I felt that everything depended on her decision. The observer finally spoke, and her voice was different, not cold and detached like before, but almost shaken, if that word could even apply to a being that has watched the galaxy for billions of years. She said that the human result wasn't a violation because the rules never forbade looking for a third option. They simply never assumed anyone would try. Every race in the entire history of the arena had always chosen one of the two provided options because their thinking operated strictly within the parameters given. They couldn't see possibilities outside the structure of the problem. She projected holograms, thousands of trials conducted over millions of years, and in every single one, the participants chose either option 1 or option 2. Only the speed of the decision varied, but the act of choosing between two options was constant. Then she said the sentence that flipped my understanding of everything. The arena wasn't created to find the most logical race, nor to see who solved standard problems best, but to find a civilization capable of thinking beyond determinism, one that could perceive solutions that shouldn't exist by definition. And humanity became the first race in the entire history of observation to demonstrate this ability not once, but consistently, in every test. The hall erupted with reactions. The Archon radiated waves of rejection, the swarm buzzed in confusion, the luminars flared with bright light. And I stood there, trying to grasp that all this time we weren't just being tested, we were being searched for. The observer continued, and with each word, the picture grew more terrifying and enormous at the same time. She explained that 5 million years ago, the oldest civilizations in the galaxy detected a signal from beyond the known universe, from a region they call the Outer Void, where the laws of physics work differently or don't work at all, where matter and energy exist in forms incomprehensible to any mind shaped by our reality. The signal wasn't a message, it was a warning, an echo of something approaching. A force or entity moving through dimensions toward our universe. And every calculation, every simulation run by the united efforts of the ancient civilizations produced one result. When this threat reaches our reality, neither technology nor logic nor millions of years of accumulated knowledge will help, because the enemy will operate outside all known laws. Its behavior would be completely unpredictable to any deterministic system. The observer said the arena was created as a tool, not to resolve conflicts as everyone had been told, but to search for a race whose mind hadn't hardened into pure logic, a race capable of fighting chaos with chaos, unpredictability with unpredictability. Thousands of civilizations had undergone the trials over millions of years, and all of them were too advanced, too rational, too predictable. And then humans appeared, young, chaotic, irrational, and we turned out to be exactly what they were looking for, a weapon against something that can't be defeated by weapons, a mind to face something that defies understanding. The Archon erupted in protest, his crystals emitting waves so intense the air around him shimmered. He shouted that this was insanity, that entrusting the protection of the galaxy to a race that barely mastered interstellar travel, that still fights among itself, that acts on emotion rather than calculation, was suicide. He said it was better to face the threat with proven methods than rely on the unpredictability of savages. The swarm supported him, their collective hum becoming deafening. They insisted that humanity was too dangerous, that we could become a greater threat than whatever was coming from the outer void, and that we needed to be isolated or destroyed immediately. But the Luminars took the opposite stance. Their representatives said that the results of the trials were undeniable, that humans proved their ability to find impossible solutions, and that if ancient civilizations couldn't find a way to fight the threat after 5 million years of preparation, then it made sense to try an unconventional approach, no matter how risky it was. A vote was called again, and this time the stakes were absolute, not just the fate of humanity, but the role we would be given in a war we hadn't even known existed hours earlier. The observer didn't vote. She simply said the choice belonged to the council, but time was running out. The threat would reach the borders of our universe in 500 Earth years. And if humanity was accepted into the galactic community, we would gain access to knowledge and technology, but in return, we would become the first line of defense, the ones who would face the incomprehensible head-on, because only our chaotic minds had even a chance of understanding what cannot be understood. I stood there listening as they decided the fate of my world, thinking, we came here believing we were fighting for the right not to be isolated, But it turned out we were fighting for the right to die first in a war we didn't know existed. And the worst part, we won that chance. The vote ended with a one-vote margin. The Luminars and the Observer were in favor, the Archons and the Swarm were against, and the deciding vote came from a species I hadn't even known existed, a being made of pure mathematics that materialized only to say one word: yes. Humanity was offered a place in the galactic community, but not the kind of place other species received, not the status of a junior partner or an observer. We were given a title that sounded like both an honor and a sentence: Agents of Chaos. The Observer explained what it meant. We would gain access to technologies, knowledge, and resources that would accelerate our development by thousands of years, but in return, humanity would take on the responsibility of solving problems that have no solution within logical systems, becoming the ones who go where other species cannot because their deterministic thinking limits them. We would not be integrated into existing structures, would not be taught their methods or protocols. On the contrary, we would be allowed to act however we see fit, because that freedom, that ability to ignore rules and find impossible paths, is our value. I listened and realized we weren't accepted into a club. We were hired as wildcards in a deck the ancient civilizations have been playing with for millions of years. And now that the stakes are the highest, they decided it was time to add an element of unpredictability. We were given 3 days on the arena before returning to Earth, and those days were strange. Other species avoided us, as if we were contagious. Only the Luminars sometimes approached, trying through telepathy to understand the mechanism of our thinking. But each time they backed away in confusion, saying there was too much noise in our heads, too many conflicting impulses that somehow coexist without canceling each other out. The Observer met with us personally, her cloud of particles forming a humanoid shape. And she said she would be our liaison to the galactic community, that when we returned to Earth, the integration process would begin. Representatives of different species would arrive, start sharing technologies. But slowly, because giving humanity everything at once could make us destroy ourselves before we ever became useful. She also warned us, not everyone in the galaxy is happy about our presence. The Archons will try to sabotage our development, the Swarm will constantly monitor our activity, looking for evidence that we are a threat, and there are species we still know nothing about who already see us as rivals or enemies. We now live in a world where every step we take will be analyzed, where humanity has become the focus of civilizations that have existed for millions of years, and that attention can be protection or a cage. She asked, "Are we ready for that responsibility?" And Rachel answered for all of us. "Do we even have a choice?" The Observer paused, then said, "No, there is no choice, because the threat will come regardless of our decision, and the only question is whether we meet it as participants or as victims." The return was as painful as the teleportation there, but this time I was ready for the pain, for the feeling of being taken apart atom by atom and put back together. When we materialized in the same underground complex in Geneva where we had left 2 weeks earlier, the world felt different, smaller, simpler, more fragile. Representatives of the UN met us, scientists, military personnel, journalists pushing through the barricades, everyone wanting to know what had happened. And we told them, not everything, because not everything could be said without causing panic, but enough for them to understand. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and that wasn't a reason to celebrate. It was a reason to prepare. A week later began what was later called the Great Contact. Ships started arriving in Earth's orbit, not military ones, but scientific, transport, and diplomatic vessels. Representatives of different species opened embassies, shared data about the galaxy, and the world was losing its mind over the news, the technologies, the realization that we were now part of something unimaginably huge. I and the other members of the team were appointed Earth's representatives in the galactic community, given titles that sounded impressive, but in reality meant that we were now between two worlds, too changed to be ordinary humans, but not alien enough to become part of the ancient species. I returned home a month later, hugged my parents who had aged in that time as if they had lived years instead of weeks, and realized I could no longer live my old life because I had seen too much, known too much. And now every night I looked at the stars and thought not about their beauty, but about the fact that somewhere out there, beyond visibility, something was moving toward us, something that would arrive in 500 years. The last time I met with the whole team was a year after our return. We were summoned to the new Galactic Coordination Center built in lunar orbit, a huge station where representatives of 20 different species worked. They showed us new data. A signal from the outer void had grown stronger, more structured, and although it was still impossible to fully decode, analysis showed that the threat was moving faster than originally predicted. Not 500 years, maybe 300, maybe less if it finds a way to accelerate through folds in space. The Archon, present as a hologram, said that all galactic resources had been redirected toward preparing for defense. Fleets were being built, weapon systems developed, simulations created for possible confrontation scenarios. But his voice sounded uncertain, and for the first time I heard something like fear in the words of a being that had lived 1,000,000 years. The Luminars added that they were trying to establish contact with the signal, to understand the nature of what was coming. But every attempt ended in failure, as if the threat existed in a dimension inaccessible to telepathy. The swarm calculated 10 trillion possible outcomes and reported that the survival rate of galactic civilization ranged from 3 to 15%, depending on strategy, and even in the best scenarios, the losses would be catastrophic. The hall fell into heavy silence, representatives of every species staring at the hologram showing the approaching unknown, and I saw in their postures, in their movements, despair and hopelessness. Then I looked at my team, Rachel, Kenji, Louisa, Stefan, and saw them smiling, all 4 of them, quietly, almost imperceptibly. And I understood why. The ancient species were afraid because for the first time in millions of years they had encountered a problem they couldn't solve with logic and calculations. But we, humans, we've spent our entire history solving the impossible, surviving where we weren't supposed to, finding exits where none existed. And for us, this threat was just another problem without a solution, another moment when you improvise, take a risk, do something crazy that works precisely because no one expects it to. I smiled too, and the observer, whose particle cloud floated in the corner of the hall, noticed. Her form trembled, and I heard her voice in my mind, meant only for me. "Are you truly not afraid?" I thought for a second and answered honestly, "I am afraid, scared to death, but fear has never stopped humans from trying to do the impossible. And maybe that's our strength, that we keep moving forward even when every calculation says we have no chance, because sometimes, just sometimes, madness wins."